Hi there, I am David Levy. I work at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America based in New York, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar with Noam Zion. Noam will be speaking about educating a giving society using 4 models from the Rabbinic, Christian, Greek, and Maimonidean perspectives. But first, today's webinar is sponsored by Chavruta, a gap year program offered jointly by the Shalom Hartman Institute and Hebrew College. This program brings together North American and Israeli students in the year following high school to live and learn together at the Shalom Hartman Institute campus in Jerusalem. As a pluralistic program, we pride ourselves on having students from a variety of backgrounds, coming from diverse places religiously, geographically, politically, and more. For those of you participating from outside North America and Israel, we welcome your students too. Chavruta's focus is global Jewish leadership. The participants spend their time in Beit Midrash style learning with scholars from the Hartman Institute and Hebrew College, as well as in internships with Jerusalem-based NGOs and in project-based community service. As with other gap year programs, they also experience the best that Jerusalem and Israel have to offer with cultural excursions throughout the city and Tiyulim throughout the country. The classroom-based portion of the program features curriculum based on the Hartman Institute's popular iEngage program, examining Israel's meaning to the Jewish world through the lens of Jewish values. There is also a new counterpart curriculum looking at world Jewry and its challenges and contributions, asking what Jewish ideas have flourished in the diaspora. The final core component is our Foundations for a Thoughtful Judaism course, and all of that is supplemented by electives. The leadership component of the program finds each participant partnered with a mentor drawn from Jerusalem's nonprofit leadership, people like Rachel Azaria from Yerushalmi and Uri Regev from Chidush. The participants also hold internships at area organizations like Ginot Ha'ir, which is the organization of JCCs, and the Center for Justice for Women and the Islamic Museum. Additionally, they participate in community service projects working on topics such as hunger, poverty, education, Mizrahi rights, and more. We would love to speak with each of you individually about Chavruta, and we particularly appreciate you putting us in touch with students and parents from your communities who would be a good fit for the program. The application for the 2015-2016 academic year is now open at chavrutagapyear.org. And you can also refer any of them to speak to us by emailing me, David Levy, that's david.levy@shalomhartman.org. And now I give you Noam. Thank you.
Shalom. I wish I could see you, but I can't. I'm Noam Zion. I've been a student of David Hartman, alav hashalom, since 1974. I've been at the Hartman Institute since 1978. And I was, some people may know me as the person who edited a Haggadah, the Hartman Haggadah, A Different Night. It's actually coming out in Portuguese soon, so if you're going to be in Rio de Janeiro for Pesach, I'll be happy to provide you a Portuguese copy. And of course, for 10 years, I worked for the Hartman Institute, working with enrichment curriculums for Judaica teachers in North America, and had a wonderful time visiting many of your schools. And we have plenty of curriculums that we've put together on rabbinics and Bible, which are available for anyone who is interested. In the last half of year, I've begun to work with the Chavruta program, which on one hand is a gap year program with the Americans, North Americans, and on the other hand is a pre-army program. It's a very interesting combination to see these Americans who are very individualistic combining with Israelis getting ready for really their most collective experience of their lives being in the army. And I'm having a wonderful time teaching this group, including people from Frisch, from a public school in Hartford, from Ramaz, from the Gan Academy, from Heschel, from all kinds of schools, and we hope to have more of your students appear, so I have the chance to teach them. They're wonderful, wonderful people, and they give me a lot of hope. Today, I'm going to be talking at the request of Leon Morris, who's the director of the program, about giving societies. And I mean that, I think clearly it's pretty relevant to many of you, since many of you are involved in fundraising. So I'm not going to talk about fundraising, but certainly the role of fundraising and of consciousness raising, educating our students, our children, to become volunteers in the Jewish community and civic society in general, to have them contribute their time, their effort, ultimately their financial abilities as well. That's a key element. There is no Jewish society, certainly not one in the diaspora or in Israel, that doesn't base itself on the willingness to volunteer. And I'd like to take a look at some of the classic cultures that have contributed to our notions of what it means to volunteer money, time, effort, your name, your expertise to various kinds of causes. I think it's sort of a chance introspectively to think about, in a coherent way, what really is the social vision of a giving society that I want to emphasize. And here, I'm not going to try to make a distinction and say, I want you to think about Jewish ways of giving as opposed to Christian or Greek ones. The opposite. I think that Jews and Christians and Westerners in general have always been eclectic in taking different models. And so I want to see what's good, but also what's radically different in the model of tzedakah. The first model we'll take a look at. I hope you have your sources before you, the Educating a Giving Society sources. The first one is tzedakah, as the rabbis envisioned it, as a form of taxation, as a tax that everybody has to pay, and then we distribute to the poor who have a right to receive those benefits. What does it mean to talk about tzedakah as a tax system, especially, of course, living in the diaspora where your taxes may go to the U.S. government or the Canadian government, but they don't go to the Jewish government or the Federation or to your local community. And yet we can still use, I hope, that model of an obligation to give almost as if it were a tax. That's model number one. Model number two is a model which is the model that Jews call chesed, especially acts of loving kindness, the most extreme example being chesed shel emet, the kind of kindness we give to a person who passes away and has no one to bury him, a kind of giving that expects no reciprocity. And I'm going to take that chesed notion and I'm going to take a look and see how Christianity takes it to an extreme which emphasizes selflessness, because I think that notion of selfless giving is very central in Western civilization. It's worth taking a look at and seeing what our attitude is toward that selfless giving. Especially if you emphasize selfless giving, you may have a harder time explaining why Jews should give to Jews. Isn't that selfish giving? And therefore it's not really giving at all, it's just taking. So each one of these models of giving really are at odds one with the other, even though in actual use we can be eclectic in using more than one. Then we're going to take a look at philanthropy. You'll see very clearly that if you'd like to make a big contribution either to your school or to the Hartman Institute, the term tzedakah is the wrong term. Now, I know we all use the term tzedakah in a very loose way, and often it's translated even more loosely as charity. And in fact, tzedakah historically actually has some quite specific meanings. I don't know if I'm going to clean up the use of our terminology in 1 hour, but at least I'd like to point in the direction of making a clear distinction between two different notions of tzedakah, a notion of charity, and a notion of Greek philanthropy, which Jews definitely do all the time, which has to do with supporting cultural institutions like your own schools and synagogues and certainly the Hartman Institute. And finally, I'd like to take a look at Maimonides' highest level of tzedakah, which in some ways shouldn't be called tzedakah at all. We'll call it, in this case, empowering tzedakah. And we'll talk about how that's radically different than the rest of Maimonides' levels of tzedakah and radically different than the other concepts we've dealt with. And I hope this will help you sort of to clarify for yourselves. And so next time you're at home, if you do get home for a dinner time with your families, not always true for educators, and you get the typical telephone call asking you to make a contribution to a wonderful organization, the 10th of the week, especially as you approach the end of the tax year, you'll be able to come up with a coherent strategy. Well, these are the kind of organizations and causes and kinds of giving that I want to emphasize in my overall strategy. And these are the ones that I'm going to say, wonderful project, not for me. I have a different sense of identity and a different sense of calling and mission when I take my disposable resources and dedicate them. Okay. Let's start in the following way. We're going to start with the tzedakah sources. You'll have, if you take a look at page number 2, what I tried to do, if you will, it's almost a PowerPoint. I listed the main points that I think describe this specific kind of giving. I'll go through some of them. If we don't get through all of them, you have them in front of you. If later you're interested in reading any of the chapters from a long intellectual history I just did on these various models of giving in the classical world, we'll be happy through David Levy to send you any of the chapters you're interested in, as well as any of the other educational projects that I've been involved with, whether Bible curriculums or curriculums on the morality, battlefield morality, or my next topic is Talmudic marital dramas. So whatever topic you're interested, whatever we have at the Hartman Institute, we're happy to share with you. Okay, tzedakah as a tax, page 2 of your sources. Tzedakah as a social welfare tax. Right? The first thing to understand about this kind of tzedakah, it's one that we know of from the Bible from the point of view of tithing, from maaser, from leket, from shichacha, from the agricultural giving, from the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. It's an agricultural notion that says that part of what grows in your land from your effort as a farmer does not belong to you, but it belongs to poor people who have the right to come and take it when they want to, or at least at the end of the season, a tithe, and for the rabbis defined it from 10% to 20%. That agricultural notion was completely individualized. There was no bureaucracy. There was no enforcement system. There's no one who could guarantee that you would be as generous as you should be. And there was no guarantee that when the poor people descended on your field to collect the payah, what was left in the field, that they would divide it up equally according to their needs. In fact, the rabbis were quite worried that the people would come using various implements and start killing one another with their rakes and with their scythes while they were collecting their food. But beginning in the rabbinic period, in the time of the Mishnah, we have the beginning of what I call tzedakah as a tax system, in which the rabbis for the first time use the word tzedakah to mean giving to the poor. In the Bible, except for one line in Aramaic in Sefer Daniel, they never use the word tzedakah to mean giving money to the poor. But the rabbis created the notion of a kupat tzedakah, of a box in which you could put dry foods, as well as tamchui, which was a kind of a tzedakah plate in which you could put to cooked foods in order to distribute to the poor. And they created a bureaucracy with the notion of a gabbai, not exactly the gabbai at your synagogue who makes sure that nobody makes mistakes in the Torah reading, but the old-fashioned gabbai you still find in some Orthodox synagogues, especially in Iranian synagogues that I've been in Iran, in which everybody who comes up to the shul to get an aliyah has to bargain for how much they're going to pay for the aliyah, or is encouraged to make a contribution. Gabbai is a tax collector. That's the modern Hebrew word for somebody who comes to take your taxes from you. So the gabbai notion was that you force people to do tzedakah. It is not a good deed. It's not a selfless deed. It's not a deed that you do voluntarily. It's a deed you have to do. And if you come, according to the rabbis, and on Shabbat afternoon and you say, I don't have any cash available, they will take, as a mashkon, they will take a piece of your property, like a pawnbroker, and say, I'm taking this piece of property. When you pay the tzedakah you owe, then you're going to get that piece of property back. So the rabbis would determine, or the gabbai, it didn't have to be a rabbi, how much each person owed. It was a proportional form of taxation. They collected the money, they distributed it according to a fixed system so that the poor had a right to receive that tzedakah. So according to different needs, you would get different amounts. It's really the first social welfare state that we know of in history, until the social welfare states that come to exist in the end of the 19th century, and especially after World War II in England, a little bit before that in Germany and Scandinavia. It wasn't a welfare state because, of course, during the diaspora, when the Jews no longer had an independent state, they didn't have the ability to tax in that way. But it was in urban areas, the Jewish community, alongside the Roman community, the Greek community, the Christian communities, the Jewish community did tax their membership, not so much to pay for public municipal services, but to pay for the poor. Not only the poor who were residents of the city, but the poor Jews who came through the town, they had a right to get tzedakah. And some of the special aspects of that tzedakah is it was a citizen's duty. And if you didn't do that duty, they could again enforce you to pay that money. It was an important principle that the giving out of that money be anonymous. Therefore, it went through an organized group distributing the money, because there was a sense that to be a citizen of such a society, the person who is self-respecting is the person who not only is able to be self-sufficient financially, but it's the person who's able to give to the community. When a person couldn't support himself and couldn't give of his own money, that was a source of terrible shame. So anonymous giving is mainly designed to protect the recipient of tzedakah, because while the intention of the giver may be generosity, sympathy, pity perhaps, the experience of the recipient by its very nature is one of shame. That's why the rabbis established that poor people also have to give tzedakah, even if they're giving tzedakah one to another from the money they have been received out of the kupat tzedakah. And even if they gave something like used clothing, the community was ordered to accept that gift in order to respect the giver. Clearly an important principle about an educating society, that everybody has to give. You give, whether it's out of money or property or time or talent, everybody should be giving something, and that's the source of self-respect you get from being a citizen who lives up to their responsibilities. Now, the larger notion of that tzedakah clearly comes from the notion of family. It comes from the notion that really human beings, one of the unique things about human beings is it takes so long for our children finally to become independent. Of course, that's becoming more and more so, right? When can your children actually support themselves? Only when they finish graduate school? For some people, that's certainly the case. So we have a very extended period of dependence, and therefore the family interdependence is what allows you to grow, to be socialized, and ultimately to become independent, but only temporarily independent. Because the nature of human life is that we are vulnerable. Vulnerable to sicknesses, vulnerable in the natural life cycle, the good life cycle, that when you're a child you're dependent, when you're a college student you're dependent, when you're elderly, and that's my next stage in life, then you become dependent. So in a society in which dependence is the very nature of who we are, interdependence, the family as a safety net is essential in order to have a community. Now, given, of course, that you can't support everybody, you don't have enough money for everyone, the rabbis developed a very strong notion of triage, of setting priorities given scarce resources. Because in principle, of course, we're all family. When I say all family, I mean, going back to the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, we are all our brother's keepers, or at least we're expected to be. And in that sense, we should all be supportive of all human beings. That's one of the unique things about the biblical story of creation, which you don't find in all ancient stories, that all human beings are descended from the same family and therefore have family responsibilities to one another. But when you have to do triage with limited sources, then you begin with taking care of who's the number one person you have an obligation to give tzedakah in this first sense to? To yourself. Right? Not a very Christian notion, not selfless in any way. The first person you have to worry about supporting is yourself, which is one of the reasons the rabbis created a ruling, a legislation, takanat usha, one I'm not so happy with, but it's an interesting one. You're not allowed to give away more than 20% of your income in any 1 year, because otherwise the danger you're going to be the one who turns into the dependent one. So every year, 20% you can give away. Now, it could be that very, 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 very wealthy Jews should be giving a lot more than 20%. That's an interesting discussion. It's not part of that original legislation. But the principle of priorities in giving says, first I take care of myself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You love yourself, and therefore you love other people like yourself, but not at the same level of priority. Then comes your family. Then comes, by a principle of proximity, those people who live nearby. Then comes a principle of those who are part of your people, even if they're farther away. Then ultimately comes the principle of all humanity who are your brothers in one way or another. So the obligation of tzedakah is for everyone. And we know that the rabbis, when they had their kupat tzedakah and they were distributing wealth to the Jewish poor, they gave to the non-Jewish and even the idolatrous poor at the same time. When the Jewish community buried Jewish dead, they also buried the Christian dead and the pagan dead. So the notion of proximity of your neighbor also applies to the people who are in your neighborhood. Right? So the difficulty here is it's not that you have a Levinasian obligation to every other wherever you are. You might have such an obligation, but when you come with limited, scarce resources, you have to decide who gets first and who gets second. That's a tough choice to make, but a very important choice to make. Now, when you choose to deal with the needs of those who are closer to you within your community, then one of the special things about rabbinic tzedakah is that you're dealing with human needs, not only in the sense of food, clothing, and shelter, but also those needs which are the needs which have to do with what makes you a human being with self-respect. So when we have a humanitarian crisis in Haiti or wherever it may be, now of course in Syria where the whole country is a humanitarian crisis, then our obligation is, quite naturally, short-term obligation, only during the crisis, to bring them basic needs, blankets, tents, food. But when we're dealing with our own community, over a longer term, we have a long-term responsibility, then we have a responsibility to take care of the needs of their own dignity. Famous story, of course, of Hillel, who wanted to serve a rich man who'd lost all of his funds. The man had been used to coming in a limousine, or at least on a horse. He had a slave to run ahead as an advance man and say, he's coming, he's coming. And Hillel, since he couldn't find another slave to hire and he couldn't find a horse, so he ran in front of the man to declare, here comes this wonderful, important person, even though financially he no longer had the wherewithal to be such an important person. So that notion that we deal with the human needs is important. One of the examples that the rabbis give is the invention of J-date. You may think it was a contemporary phenomenon of the internet, but it actually appears in the Midrash, in the Talmud, in the Sugya in Ketubot 67a and b, where it says, De machsoro asher yachsar lo, you give to people that need which is their personal need. So if you see you have an orphan, then you're going to have to get for that orphan a bride. You're going to have to, of course, supply the bride and the husband and the wife, the orphans, with a house, with everything you need to fill the house in terms of dishes, and you're going to have to find the right partner for them. So matchmaking services are actually an explicit part of this notion of tzedakah, which is the tax system of tzedakah. Let's stop with that notion for a moment. You've got the general notion. It's a kind of a social security system. Everybody contributes, and therefore whenever there's somebody, and there will always be somebody having need, that person can get backing. That notion of tzedakah, that sense of vulnerability, has been a hallmark of the Jewish community, precisely because since the Jews went into the diaspora, they have been particularly vulnerable, even more than human beings are normally vulnerable, because of the kind of businesses they were in, because of political persecution. They were vulnerable that suddenly the one who was rich could become the one who was poor, the one who was well established could become the immigrant. And in fact, the most important social service agencies of the Jewish community in the United States were created. HIAS and JDC and the Federation were created around serving the needs of Jewish immigrants, the Landsmannschaft. And so that sense of common vulnerability is very central to that notion of giving tzedakah as social welfare tax. This notion of tzedakah is not an easy one to teach today, precisely because American Jews, I think you know better than I, North American Jews feel more comfortable and confident about their independent economic situation. They're confident that they have a safety net provided, well, it depends on how Obamacare goes, for good or for bad, and Canada is obviously in much better shape. You can count on the social welfare system of the state Of course, something that's only existed for less than 100 years in the West and still has a long way to go if it does move in that direction in the United States. And so it's not so easy today to convince Jews that their giving to the Jewish community's social services should be seen as a form of social security, of mutual insurance for one another, because they think that they don't need it, or at least the Jewish community is not the primary supporter of that. It's also true, of course, in terms of support for Israel, at least that aspect of Israel having to do with Ethiopian immigrants, Russian Jewish immigrants, Syrian immigrants. In the Merkaz Klita in my daughter's neighborhood in Beersheba, they just got a small family of Yemenite Jews who just made Aliyah. But the sense of this mass immigration and the need to support immigrants, as that disappears from the Jewish scene these days, again, part of the logic of this tzedakah is also threatened. Let's take a look at a second notion of tzedakah, a totally different one, and that's on page 3. It's charity, or chesed. So let's take a look at a very good Jew named Shaul, who later changed his name to Paul, because he really defines, I think, a powerful ideal, especially as we get into the Christmas season after Thanksgiving. And Paul writes, "If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames," Paul seemed to have a thing here about self-sacrifice, viewing himself as following in the footsteps of Jesus' willingness to sacrifice himself. "But I have not love, I gain nothing. Love does not boast, it's not proud, it's not self-seeking. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Now, some of you, depending on your good Christian education growing up in North America, may remember the term as these three, faith, hope, and charity. It's not a difference in the text. The word caritas, or in Greek agape, means love. The word for charity is love. And therefore, if you give money or support to another human being who's in need, and it's not a reflection of love, then it is not charity. Whether it's recognized by the IRS or not, it doesn't count as charity from a Christian point of view. Now that principle is really, really central. If your giving is self-seeking, if your giving is for you, then not only is it not the highest level of giving, it is a sin. It's a sin of pride. It's not in any way a value that's going to be honored. And by the way, it's a very strong element. I've talked to many Jews deeply influenced by the powerful Christian model of selfless giving, of chesed, the Jewish value, and they really say, well, why would I want to give to the Jewish community? Isn't that by its very nature self-love, selfishness? Isn't charity about overcoming selfishness and sharing with other people different than myself? The more different they are, the more, not they deserve my charity, but the greater act of love and selflessness I show when I give to them. Think about the classic saint of our times, the Christian saint Mother Teresa, and if I give you a quiz and ask you what her nationality is, how many people would know that she is? Albanian, one of the countries I have not been to. And this Albanian sister spent, of course, all of her life in India. And in India, who was she taking care of? The sick, especially in hospices. And who were these sick? Well, they weren't Christians. For the most part, they were Hindus and they were Muslims. Her whole notion of charity is the love you give to the one who's totally other than you, who's not in any way your brother, not in any way your family, not in any way part of a reciprocal group of people who take mutual responsibility for one another. It's not the notion of arevim zelazeh, that all Israel are co-guarantors for one another, because there's no obligation here, there's no guarantee. It's a selfless act of giving. Now it's important here that Mother Teresa's giving, for the most part from what I've read, was hospice giving. It was giving to the people who were going to die. It was a giving of love, of care, of giving meaning to their suffering. But it had nothing to do with curing them, And in fact, Mother Teresa, I've read, discouraged the nurses and the nuns following in her order from learning public medicine because she didn't want them to be nurses or doctors. She wanted them to be caregivers in the basic sense of love during suffering. The goal is not to get rid of suffering, to solve the problem of illness. The point is to show love and compassion and pity for those people who are in desperate need, and to do it as an act as Jesus would do that act. It's important here. You cannot do charity out of a sense of obligation. Charity cannot be related to justice or obligation. As Paul said, taking a look at the second source from Corinthians, each one must do as he has made up his mind, and not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Cheerful means a voluntary giver. In fact, when I worked with the Jewish community, the Federation in Columbus, Ohio, for the Hartman Institute many years ago, they told me about a Jewish giver that they had a lot of problems with. She always told them, I don't like giving to the Federation. I like giving to Christian causes. The Christians make me feel so good for my generosity, for my expression of love for helping them. The Jews, I give them some money and they say, good, you have done your duty. You've lived up to your obligation. You're a good citizen of the Jewish people. But they don't praise me. They don't make me feel the generosity of my giving. Now, that notion, that deep Christian notion, is that acts of giving have to be anonymous. But the anonymity is not anonymity of the recipient who doesn't know who they're receiving from. It's the anonymity of the giver, so the giver shouldn't be giving for the sense of pride. When I worked again in Columbus, Ohio, one of the great sources of my insights, whatever ones I have about the Federation world, then one of the women there, a wonderful woman named Schottenstein, a cousin of the Schottenstein Talmud, but not from the same ideological position. She went to volunteer the services of what she knew about fundraising to help a group of Lutheran lay people to raise money for their hospital when they were building a new wing. And she said, oh, you're in great shape. You'll do just what we do. You're going to put a wonderful brick lobby into the new part of the wing of the building. And according to the size of the gift, they will get a bigger plaque, a smaller plaque, maybe a little brick or something like that. And that's how you're going to come to your donors. And Lutheran said to her, we can't do that. You can't tell people how much to give. You can't promise people that their name will be on the wall, because then it won't be charity. It won't be an act of love. It'll be an act of selfishness, and it will be the sin of pride. Her advice was just not very useful, at least in this particular Lutheran hospital. There are plenty of Christians, of course, just as there are plenty of Jews who've learned how to use the use of plaques in order to generate much bigger gifts, but it's not part of the deep Christian value of anonymous giving. Let's take a look for a moment at philanthropy. Now we get to big money gifts, because philanthropy is the preferred American term for giving large amounts of money with named gifts to big institutions, whether they are synagogues or universities or hospitals. In fact, some of the very biggest recipients in the United States, besides all the small gifts that go to churches, are the big gifts to universities. The bigger the gift, the more likely it goes to an institution. And it's an institution that will bear your name on it. In fact, an interesting way that this continues to have an effect on our use of language, I read a wonderful study about the use of the term charity in the UK and the use of the term philanthropy in the United States outside of church circles. So it turns out that in the UK, the preferred term is charity, not philanthropy. And charity in the UK means giving anonymously. It means altruistically. It means self-sacrifice. It's really very close to what we talked about as the Christian notion of charity. Part of that selflessness is that the British are opposed to giving you a tax credit for your charity. It wouldn't be charity. Recently, I've heard from some of my Jewish friends in England that what the government in UK has allowed is that you'll get a 25% contribution from the state, from the UK, to whichever organization you're giving a donation to. They'll expand the donation, but they won't give you a tax credit because that would not be charity. And who is the biggest recipient in general of charity in the UK? It's Oxfam and similar organizations. About 25% of the gifts go overseas for basic needs of food, for people starving in Africa and in other places with humanitarian needs. That's really what charity is. It's more Mother Teresa than it certainly is tzedakah in the sense of Jewish kupat tzedakah, and it's certainly not philanthropy. In fact, if you give money to a college or to a church, you're not going to get any tax benefit at all in England because, of course, the church is supported by the government, the Anglican Church, and the universities, for the most part, are supported by the government. So it's a radically different notion of what it means to give. It's charity. In America, however, according to this study, outside the churches, people prefer the word philanthropy. They prefer to give a named gift. They prefer to give it as a planned gift. Well, in the UK, one of the most popular and the biggest grossing forms of collection is the spare change method, if you can call it a method. Think about the Salvation Army. You go out and you ring a bell and you take a little pot and people throw it in. That's one of the main ways that UK citizens give their charity money. In America, the preference is for writing a check, for planning your big donations in advance, for doing it through foundations, so you also get your tax benefit. And most of the recipients are people who are Americans. You don't give abroad, you give to your community, to your alma mater, to the hospital near you, to your community. And that notion is close to the original notion of philanthropy, which is our third model of giving and a very powerful one. Let's read just a quotation here from Aristotle. The magnificent man is an artist in expenditure. He can discern what is suitable and spend great sums with good taste. I love this description. It's a way of giving money in such a way as it adds to the luster of your status as an aristocrat. Because Greek giving was given by the aristocratic class, the people who were magnificent men. Notice our term magnanimity, from the word magna, good, or largesse. The bigger man you are, the more you give lots of money, you give it with style, you give it not in a tight-wadded way where you're counting the calculations. Your generosity is what creates the sense of yourself. The word generosity also comes from the Greeks, from your genes, because the giving is a reflection of your noblesse oblige, of your status as an aristocrat. Now, who did the Greeks give philanthropy to? The actual term they preferred to use was the term euergia, which means good works. Well, they did not give their money to the poor, ever. They never gave it to the stranger. They never gave it to the lower classes who weren't citizens. They didn't give it to their fellow citizens as such. They would give their money either to their friends in exchange of very big gifts that helped to establish their status, right? And they gave in large amounts both their time and their money. They gave to the polis, to the city, to the municipality. Because the Greeks did not believe in immortality. They didn't believe that their individual soul would go off into Hades and be remembered in its individuality. So if you wanted immortality, then you had to give to an institution that would outlive you. And that institution was the polis. Take an institution, not a Greek one, but a Roman one of the Roman city, the city of Rome, which was founded in 750, I think 753 BCE, and continued for over 1,000 years. Many of the Greek cities, Athens, considered for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Greeks, of course, assumed that their cities would last forever. And so by contributing to a city, you made yourself immortal. Your name would be remembered by the people of your city from generation to generation. Now, there were two ways that you could become immortal in Greece. You could become immortal because you won the Olympics, because you won, for example, Aeschylus, you won the competitions for among theater or in music or in many different areas. Or you could become famous because you sponsored the Olympics, because you sponsored the competitions for dramatic productions, or because you made contributions to the city, and the city would memorialize you for a lot of money with a statue. For less money, your name would go into a special institution, the metropolis, in which they would write down everybody who'd made a contribution to the city, and from generation to generation, you would be remembered. Now, this kind of giving is not a giving for basic needs. It's a giving to the community to make your community great. It was the ancient chamber of commerce, if you will. And the notion was you were contributing to humanity not in terms of their most limited needs. You were contributing to what makes human beings truly human, which is logos, which is speech, which is culture, which is art, which is sports, which is war, because sometimes people would give a worship as a form of philanthropy. Plus, they gave their time to sit on the city council, because city councils, mayors, they were never paid in the Greco-Roman, in the Greek world, because it was a matter of the aristocrats who would donate their time in that way. And so you can see there's a very powerful, and I would say a very positive model of what philanthropy means. It's an obligation to the civic society. That's not part of tzedakah. It's not part of charity. But it's a form of Greek giving, which of course was absorbed first by the Jews and then by the Christians, as they began to have wealthy Jews and wealthy Christians who wanted to establish themselves. And I'm sure it wouldn't be hard for you to look around in every city that you live in and to figure out which symphonies were given by Jews, which opera houses, which museums. I'm right now in New York City, that wouldn't be difficult at all. Which ballet houses, which synagogue buildings, which have to be, of course, beautiful synagogue buildings in order for somebody to want to identify with them. Beauty is very important. All of those notions are the very central to philanthropy. Now, I think that we have a lot to learn from that model. It's a model that takes human pride, which, of course, the Christians want to nix as a form of selfishness and self-love, a crime, and to take that selfishness and to identify the self of the individual with the whole community. So the Greek model was overcoming selfishness by expanding the self to include the whole community and saying the community is what gives meaning to the self, because the community praises you, honors you, commemorates you on a plaque in multiple kinds of ways. I think that's something the Jewish community has learned to do, especially in the Federation world, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Because you're taking people's, if you will, Yetzer Hara, or for the Greeks, their Yetzer HaTov, and you're shaping it into an expectation that the more money you have, the more influence you have, the greater your responsibility to take care of your whole community, the Jewish community, and of course the whole community, the civic community. And that notion is a powerful one, and certainly I would not be able to be a scholar at the Hartman Institute if there weren't philanthropists who believed that they wanted to keep a rabbinic culture, a Jewish culture, on the cutting edge and to support it. Now, that culture of the Hartman Institute, like many institutions, also wants to contribute to the Jewish people as a whole. It also wants to teach about social justice. It wants to teach about the needs of the poor, right? Very often the philanthropic notion, which was never classically concerned with the poor, now it is. And so you can have a Bill Gates who gives an enormous amount of money in order to find solutions, for example, to illnesses that affect the poorest people in the third world. He's combined a philanthropic notion, it's the Bill Gates Foundation, it has his name on it, with the notion of helping the poor in order to solve some of their problems. Let's look at the last category. It's really a double category. It's the category of Maimonides' 8th level of tzedakah. Tzedakah is empowerment. And it's also the model of tikkun olam, or the prophetic model of tzedakah. Let's start with the Maimonidean one. As you know, the first 7 levels of Maimonides' tzedakah are all based on the principle that the more anonymous, the better. If you reach the level where the giver is anonymous and the recipient protects his or her anonymity, then you've reached the highest level, because giving tzedakah causes shame. The kind of tzedakah that's giving for the first 7 levels is the kind of tzedakah that we talked about as the first category. It's tzedakah as social welfare. It's about maintenance. That's what welfare is about maintaining people as they are, not solving their problems. But Maimonides' 8th level is a totally different category. You can see that text on page 6 of your sources. I'll read it in English. The highest, this is text C on page 6. The highest, supreme level of tzedakah is one who supports a member of the Jewish people who has come by hard times, literally has gone down in the world, by handing him a gift or a loan, entering into a partnership with him, or finding work for him. Those are the 4: a gift or a grant, a loan, a partnership, or a job, so that he would not need to beg from other people, because begging for Maimonides is the worst form of shame. Concerning such, the Torah in Vayikra says, you are to sustain them vechazakta, like a stranger or a resident, that he may live with you. That means sustain him so that he will not lapse into poverty. Now, what Maimonides is talking about is something that I wouldn't call tzedakah at all. And the truth is that almost nobody else in the Middle Ages ever calls the notion of giving a free loan or an interest-free loan, ever calls it tzedakah. Maimonides is the only one. And in fact, in the laws of loans, Hilchot Halvaot, Malveh Veloveh, Maimonides calls it the mitzvah of a loan. He doesn't call it tzedakah. I want you to see why it's not tzedakah in the classic way. You can see that with another one of the sources on this page, page 6. Source number B. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Greater is the lender than the one who does tzedakah. If giving a loan, think about microloans, for example, is not tzedakah, because if you're a lender, it's higher than tzedakah. It's not tzedakah. And what's even higher than being a lender? One who puts money in a kitty, in a kis, as a partnership with someone in need, is the greatest of all. The highest level of giving is entering into a business partnership where you both give your advice and your input as an investor, and it's also where you, of course, might make money off of this fellow if his startup works properly, but it's not tzedakah in the sense that it would cause any shame. Nobody who's trying to start a startup, no entrepreneur, feels that when somebody invests in their business that it's tzedakah, that it's a gift out of pity. It's really, of course, I believe in you, it's venture capital, I know it's high risk. Obviously, lending money to a poor person who has a bad credit rating is a very risky kind of investment, but it's not tzedakah as such, even though Maimonides calls it the highest level of tzedakah. The logic is a different kind of a logic. There's no anonymity in giving a loan, giving a grant, giving a job, or entering into a partnership. The opposite. It's a normal relationship. Anonymity is only necessary where there is shame. I think Maimonides calls giving a job a form of tzedakah because the giver knows that he maybe doesn't need to hire anybody. And the giver knows that he's going to invest this money and he knows he's probably going to lose it. And he's going to give this loan and he'll never get to see the money again. So the motivation of the giver may be tzedakah. But from the point of view of the recipient, this is not tzedakah. This is a higher level of giving help to people, which adds to their dignity because it gives them the dignity of a job, the dignity of a business, the dignity of I can support myself, the dignity that somebody gives me credit, literally credit, that I can make my business work, that I can return the loan eventually. One of the tzedakahs that my family gives to on a regular basis, and you can see which of the four notions of tzedakah we're very attracted to, is IFLA, the Israel Free Loan Society, which is the largest in the in Israel, the largest in the world of a free loan society. It's not micro lending where you lend money with interest. There's no interest whatsoever. And they give their loans to Ethiopians, to Russian immigrants, to people who were badly hurt economically during, for example, the last Gaza war or the previous attacks on the north from Hezbollah. All to people who, if they went to the bank would say, you're a bad credit risk, we won't lend you. Then they help the people both plan the use of the money, they follow up with them, they collect on a regular basis their payments, and they have a 99% return rate on their loans, which is an incredible achievement because they don't give to the poorest people. Notice, when you give tzedakah as social welfare, who do you give to? You give to whoever is more needy gets more help. When you give charity, who do you give charity to in a Christian sense? You give chesed to the people who are most down and out. But when you're giving empowerment tzedakah, Maimonides' highest level, then you're giving to the strongest poor people, the people who have a chance to pull themselves out of poverty to become self-supporting, dignified people, members of society, who can then make contributions to their family members and to society in general. It's a totally different logic. When you're forced to decide with your limited amount of money and time, who are you going to contribute it to? Are you going to contribute to the people who need it the most? Drug addicts, for example, the people who are in hospices, clearly on their way out of this world, or are you going to give it to the people who need it least, if you will, but who can use your resources to pull themselves up, and they're the most likely to turn that resource into a takeoff situation. So, the giving which is problem solving, the giving which is giving resources to people, social entrepreneurship, that is Maimonides' highest level of tzedakah. It's about bringing progress in which there's an improvement over time. It's the opposite of Mother Teresa's loving chesed shel emet for people who are dying, who she cannot help, and helping is not her purpose if helping means getting well, and helping means getting yourself out of poverty. The last notion, as we run out of time and we run out of my book, which is 2,300 pages on this topic, is to get to giving, which is the prophetic model of tzedakah. When the prophets use, as they do over and over and over again, the term tzedakah umishpat, they don't mean giving money, they mean social justice. Tzedakah umishpat is a hendiades, two words that mean the same thing, that mean social justice. It's the language used in 2011 in Israel when you had hundreds of thousands of people coming out for demonstrations, and they would march and say, Anachnu dorshim tzedek chavrati velo tzedakah. We want social justice, we don't want tzedakah. By tzedakah they meant charity. Tzedek chavrati is giving people what their rights are. But the key element here is that the sense of the prophets and of the people marching in 2011, and of many people working for NGOs, is that poverty is not a misfortune. Poverty is not one of those vulnerabilities that anybody can lose their job. Anybody can be forced to migrate. Anybody can get sick. That's true. That's why you need social insurance. That's tzedakah as social welfare. But the prophets, like Yeshayahu, like Amos in particular, like Micha, like Yirmiyahu and parts of Yeshayahu, they all said that poverty is caused by wicked people. Wealthy people are the exploiters of the poor. Wealthy people are the people who take advantage of the poor and make them even worse. They take advantage of them in terms of the court system, which tilts towards the wealthy and powerful. They take advantage in terms of selling to them at high prices. They take advantage of lending them money and then taking their children as slaves, as collateral to the loans. The prophet's notion of tzedakah is tied to tzedek. It's tied to the sense that there's a social injustice in the system. And the goal of the prophets, and certainly the goal of the NGOs, and the whole goal of the way in which tikkun olam has been reinterpreted from a mystical notion into a social justice notion, is that we have to identify what's wrong with the system. What laws are causing problems and have to be changed? What power differentials between the rich and the poor have to be restructured in such a way that the poor are not exploited by the rich? Which criminals have to be put in jail in order to prevent these things? That's motivated by a different sense. If you will, each one of the five notions of giving we've talked about is based on a different basic human emotion. The human emotion about tzedakah's social welfare is achava, brotherhood, responsibility. Arevim zelazeh, we're guarantors. You give because it's an obligation of a member of your community, of your family, of the human race to support other people, as interdependence is the key to human flourishing, because we will always be in need at one time or another of our lives. The motivation for charity is chesed. It's pity. It's condescension sometimes. It's sympathy for the weak and the suffering. It's a wonderful emotion, but it's very different than the one of responsibility. Philanthropy is based on the pride. That's the powerful motive. The pride of what I did to make a great city with a great symphony. Now, of course, you can be proud of your city for having a wonderful social justice system, for having a wonderful social welfare system, but the emotion is pride. My name is on it. I want my children and grandchildren to see the way I've made contributions. And the major motivation, emotional motivation, for that notion which is tikkun olam, or tzedek in the prophetic sense, is righteous indignation. That burning wrath that A.J. Heschel talks about when he talks about the prophets. And last but not least, Maimonides' highest level of empowerment tzedakah is moved by a desire for being a problem solver. I'm the entrepreneur who solved business problems. I'm going to bring my business mentality and I'm going to solve the problems that are causing suffering and injustice to people as well. I'm committed to progress, making it a better world. So I'd like to end with one of my favorite quotations from, my wife is Dutch, so you won't be surprised I want to quote from Anna Frank, page 6 at the very top. Diary of Anna Frank, March 1944, Amsterdam. How lovely to think that no one need wait a moment before making the world better. We can start now, slowly changing the world. You can always, always, always give something. Even if it's only kindness. Give again, don't lose courage, keep it up, and go on giving. And I wish you and the Jewish people and humanity much success in educating giving societies and the next generation of wonderful, great givers. Thank you very much.